Good
evening.
He's never done that before.
That's the thing that I say.
We'll say it again. No.
Sparkly.
Good evening.
Good evening.
There we go. You think that just because we're starting a new book, you can get all fancy with me? I don't know. Okay, well, last week we had a ketchup bottle that was our guest last week.
It's half gone.
How did you go through half a giant bottle of ketchup in a week?
I made a triple recipe of baked beans.
Oh my goodness.
Did you eat all of
And
them?
they ate all but about a cupful.
You're going to get a triple heart attack, I think.
Well, it ranged
Not any worse than a Hot Pocket will give you.
2 years old to 80 years old.
This week we have my parents, so there's absolutely no pressure on me to perform well tonight at all.
I have low expectations
They
already.
probably do. Yeah. Last week we covered a whopping one verse out of the book of James, and I said last week, and it still holds true, because we're not going to cover 2 chapters tonight. Be thankful. That we're going to have to end up stealing a Sunday night from Lester if we want to finish in time. And I'm sure out of the graciousness of his heart, he will allow me to steal that from him.
I might let you if you're good.
Yeah, if I'm good. So we're only covering the rest of chapter 1. I don't think realistically we can make up what we missed and try to cover 2 chapters tonight. But so we're starting in verse 2, and I think the whole time we covered Hosea, we just read through the chapter and then talked about it. But the good part about these epistles is that, they have really nice breaks in them. So we can go a couple verses and then stop, a couple verses and stop. So we're going to do verses 2 through 8 is the first section that we're going to cover. So starting in verse 2, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any one of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. When you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Okay, so just like when we covered Hosea, I'm sort of pitting 2 commentaries against each other, trying to have a well-rounded idea of what the text is talking about. But I thought that this was interesting. Both commentaries actually reference the book of Sirach. Sure, we'll go with that. And the book of Wisdom, or the Wisdom of Solomon. And so they both talk about wisdom. Obviously, it's in the name. But Sirach 4, verse 11, wisdom teaches her children and takes hold of those who seek her. And then jumping to verse 17, for at first she will walk with them in disguise. She will bring fear and dread upon them and will torment them by her discipline until she trusts them, and she will test them with her ordinances. So one of the commentators that referenced this, he said, the gift of wisdom in James is linked with the trials his readers were enduring. The connection is made in Sirach 4:17 when the children of wisdom, get that from verse 11, when the children of wisdom are trained by her discipline and tested by her ordinances. And then the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9, verse 6, for every one of you is perfect among humans. For everyone who is perfect among humans will be regarded as nothing without the wisdom that comes from you. And then a quote on that, it says, there is a more definitive link between wisdom and perfection, which is the goal set in verse 4 of James, which is Wisdom 9:6, which offers a clear statement parallel to James's thought. So the reason that I even bring all this up is because, in James, and then specifically looking at like these other books that James may or may not be referencing, you have the connection between trials, wisdom, and perfection. They're all sort of linked together. And it's going to be a repeating theme throughout this chapter. So if that's the case, if we have trials, wisdom, and perfection, they're all sort of linked together, then this is your first blank. When somebody asks God for wisdom, they might just be asking for trials. It's like that joke. If you're not a patient person, just ask God to give you patience, and He'll just put you in an impatient situation. It's kind of like that joke. When you ask God for wisdom, He might just give you trials. Just trials and wisdom and perfection, they're all linked together. And this reading actually makes sense, especially given, we get to verse 13, and, it talks about how God does not tempt people. And I think basically James is trying to correct a possible misreading of his letter before it happens, right? You ask God for wisdom, He might give you a trial, and then people might misread that to say, well, God is tempting me. And James says, no. Before people even say that, I'm going to go out of my way to deny that. So that's sort of one way to look at this. And I'm not necessarily presenting these as like opposite ways, like it either is A, or it is B, or it is C. Just kind of different lenses that you can look at this section through. Which brings us to B. In addition to A, there's also the reversal of A. So this is a quote about that. It says, wisdom also is necessary to endure testing of faith. So not only do believers in Christ ask for wisdom that may or may not bring trials that produce wisdom, but believers in Christ, and this is your blank, believers in Christ ask for wisdom within the trials. So ask God for wisdom. He might give you a trial. When you're in the trial, you might ought to ask for wisdom. And then in both circumstances, this is a blank, the trial is from God for the perfection of the believer. So this is where we got that perfection idea that we see in verse 4. Okay, so I had my own trial this afternoon trying to format this, especially your version of this. Because I thought, I just do like the fill in the blank thing like I would normally do. And, the number of spaces that a character takes up on Google Docs, if you just put in that many spaces of the fill in the blank, it's really, really tiny. You can't actually write. So I have to basically like triple, if there's like 5 letters, I'd have to put like 15 spaces worth of the little line. Well, obviously when I do that, it throws all the formatting up for, this is basically supposed to be like a, like a flow chart or something, like a line chart. And it just messes the whole thing up. So you don't have blanks. I just took the words that would be blanks and just like highlighted over them and, try your darndest to write above it or in the margin or something, whatever you want to do. But the only one that really got messed up formatting wise was B. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But okay, so reading A, basically flowchart style. And we're starting really on the second line and then reading up, which is kind of confusing. But who? Well, believers. What are believers doing? They're asking. What are they asking for? And then this is your first blank, wisdom. Believers are asking for wisdom from God, who sends, and you can probably already guess this based on what we had under reading A, trials and perfection. The result for the believer is trials that ideally lead to perfection. And we're going to talk a little bit about that perfection idea, so don't get ahead of me. Or another way to look at this, same idea, just rephrased a little bit differently. God sends trials to believers for wisdom and perfection. So again, it's all sort of interlinked. It all comes full circle. Okay. So reading B. This is the one where the formatting is off. So that what is technically the first blank right under God actually belongs on the right-hand side of completion. So it should be blank to completion blank. And by the time I realized that, I had already printed all these out. So my apologies. So there's not a blank under God. Who? God. What does he do? He sins. What is he sending? Trials. Who's he sending trials to? He's sending trials to believers who then ask for wisdom in order to persevere to completion, or in other words, perfection, which is that blank that would be under God. So that was a lot of like blank writing. We went fast. Judy almost always misses a blank. Did you miss a blank this time?
Yes, the very last one.
The one that's under God? Is that the one you're talking about? So it should be persevere to completion, and then perfection is the parenthesis part, which is under God but belongs to that last idea.
Okay. Thank you. I always miss one.
Okay, so moving into verses 6 through 8, we're still dealing with these three interconnected ideas: trials, wisdom, perfection. And you get this word that's translated double-minded. And this is a quote from like a dictionary, Bible dictionary, essentially. Wavering, lacking in faith, especially in times of persecution, when constancy and resolution in faith are called for. So here's another blank. So then, perseverance not only brings about perfection, and that's the idea of reading B from the flowchart. Perseverance not only brings about perfection, but it also brings about the blessings of God. So, verse 7, that person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord, should not expect to receive any of the blessings of the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all that they do. And if we talked about this double-minded thing, is especially, as it says, especially in times of persecution, then perseverance through persecution not only brings about that wisdom and perfection, but it also brings about the blessings of God. And I think this is really cool because we talked about this a lot when we covered Hosea. This is a quote. It says, if a basically biblical source of what James is pulling from, James is sort of getting this idea from a part of the Old Testament, then the most obvious reference is to the warnings against divided loyalty to God. Specifically, it mentions Deuteronomy 26:16, which is, here's what I've given you to do, obey it and live, basically. And so there's a quote from basically Jewish rabbis writing a commentary on Deuteronomy. And it said, when making your prayer to God, do not have two hearts, one for God and one for something else. And so that's basically the same idea that James is putting out here. When you ask God for wisdom, this is, I I think you're blank. Yes. When you ask God for wisdom, be sure to persevere and stay faithful, which is the opposite of double-minded, right? If your first blank, perseverance brings about the blessings of God, then being double-minded, not persevering, it's, as the rabbi says, making your prayer to God with two hearts, one for God and one to something else. You're being double-minded, you're not persevering, and when you pray, as James says in verse 7, that person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord, right? So it kind of works both ways, right? You do this, you can expect to receive it. If you don't do it, you can't really expect to receive anything. Like I said, we talked about this a lot in Hosea, this sort of syncretizing true religion with false religion, truly being double-minded, right? I'm serving God at a pagan temple, or I'm serving a pagan at a Christian temple, but then even the Christian temples weren't really supposed to be there to begin with, so that's also sort of syncretism, and it just goes on, and that's basically what James is getting at here. Which brings us to reading C. Who? Believers who are asking for either A or B, they're either asking for wisdom and they get trials, or they're asking for wisdom within trials, must be faithful / persevere. They must persevere in order to receive answered prayer. You must persevere in order to receive answered prayer. Okay. Anyone miss any other blanks before we jump into 9 through 18? I will probably never again. I had my trial, and I think I did not persevere well through my trial, because I think the lesson, the wisdom that I gained from my trial is that I will never again try to do a flow chart, because that was a formatting nightmare. Anyway, okay. Verse 9. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant, its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised, to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. So, okay. Moving on a little bit, hopefully picking up the pace a little bit, no more flow charts or anything. We get to verse 9, very similar to verse 2. Verse 2, consider it pure joy when you face trials. Verse 9, if you're in humble circumstances, if you're poor, basically, take pride in your high position. That, as I used to say in seminary, that one won't preach. You say some that people like to hear, that'll preach. You say some people don't like to hear, that one ain't going to preach. But James says it anyway. It's in addition to that, he also says that those who are rich, those who are not in humble circumstances, should be humble. So James really likes these sort of table-turning statements, going against the, I would say the culture of his time, but I mean, it's people also think like this today. So just going against the culture in general. He likes to sort of use these table-turning statements a lot. James's idea of wealth, however, it's really not negative, it's actually quite neutral. Money is. It exists. It's there. But it doesn't exist forever. And that's pretty much his point. The people who would ordinarily have a proud life should be humble. Or, as James says, they should take pride in their humiliation, since money is such a fleeting thing. Right? Meanwhile, the people who ordinarily would live a humble life should be proud, as James says, in their high position, since they have nothing to lose. Right? Verses 9 through 11 are sandwiched between verses about perseverance under trials. And, if you remember, James actually says the double-minded will not receive the wisdom they asked for because they're not persevering under trials. So here's your blank for this. To James, it's easier to be poor because it is one less thing to be double-minded about. If you are rich, however, James advises you to be proud in your humiliation, or be proud in the fact that your riches are fleeting. So it's not this sort of, self-deprecating, woe is me, I am a millionaire with my Maserati. But actually, right, James is saying, okay, well, basically don't be double-minded in anything, right, especially money. So if you're rich, right, be proud of the fact that it is fleeting. In other words, recognize that it's not really anything to be double-minded about because it's here today and gone tomorrow. And if you don't have money, be glad about that because that's one less temptation to be double-minded, to draw you away from that faithful perseverance that James was just talking about. So that brings us to verse 13. We switched to the idea of testing. I sort of played my hand earlier, and like I said, this is likely James offering a preliminary rebuke of someone who might misinterpret his words. Ask for wisdom and God will give you trials. So, God is tempting me to place my trust in my money, right? And James says, no, you're just wrong. No, you're just dumb. Right. So we're switching to the idea of testing, but like I said, it is all connected. And once again, James seems to be going back to this idea of the double-minded man. He says each person is dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. So, yeah, this is the start. This is the start of your blank. Rather than persevere towards perfection, the sinner becomes double-minded, which eventually leads back to a single-mindedness. All this double-minded, single-minded thing is probably getting confusing. The sinner becomes double-minded, which eventually leads back to a single-mindedness. The difference is that it's a single-mindedness towards sin that leads to death. Right? So you start out double-minded, and, Jesus said, right, you can't serve God and money. What he meant by that is eventually, I don't think that what Jesus meant is that you can't serve God and money because eventually you're just going to, serve God. What he meant is, right, if you're serving God and money, eventually you're going to give up God and start serving money. James is getting at the same thing, right? That double-mindedness is eventually going to become single-mindedness, but it's going to be a single-mindedness towards sin that leads to death. As opposed to, this is the second half of that blank, as opposed to, if you were never double-minded at all, if you persevere, a single-mindedness towards faith that leads to perfection and a crown of life. As James says, having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And ultimately, this is the last part of the blank. Ultimately, The only completely single-minded person is God. You probably did not need me to say that for you to get that. And we see that in verse 17. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like the shifting shadows. He doesn't change. He's single-minded, right? So, this whole idea of perfection that James is getting at, right? The believer is in the process of becoming like God, the process of being made into his image, the process of being made into perfection. But James is far from preaching an achievable perfection, even if he may or may not be preaching a theoretical perfection. But that's a whole nother discussion that we're not going to get into. But just know, I mean, James himself points out, right, the only person who is ever 100% of the time not double-minded is God. So, okay. That brings us to 19 through 27, our last section. Did anyone miss a blank or anything?
I got them all.
There we go!
She has repented.
It's cause I'm here.
Okay. All right, so starting in verse 19. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not look at his face in a mirror, and after looking at himself, Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror, and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. All right, so talking about striving towards godly perfection, that was sort of the last thing that we talked about before we got into this section. Look at verse 20, right? Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. That idea of the righteousness that God desires, that idea of perfection, right? It's here that we really see a very applicable list of do's and don'ts. It's probably a bit different study than the Minor Prophets. At least it feels that way when I'm preparing all this. Not as technical. We're not gonna go over your head and write the Greek on the board, or the Hebrew, I guess, for the Minor Prophets. It's a lot more applicable. And I mean, the reason is, one, it's applicable for us because, this is New Testament, we are New Testament people. But also, the nature of an epistle is that it's just very applicable. Do this, don't do this. You guys are a bunch of knuckleheads. You need to whip into shape. And so it's very applicable. You can take this will preach, right? This will preach. And so we have our, a very applicable list of do's and don'ts. Do, be quick to listen. Do, be slow to speak. Do, be slow to anger. Do not just listen, right? And this is your blank. It is here. We get our first significant taste of James's emphasis on action. See, you probably thought I was going to say words, but I tricked you. Action. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves, but do what it says, right? In sermons past, I had never preached this at this church. This was his church. But I basically took what James said here and put it in the good old Parker Smith translation. And I said, what I'm talking about is the mirror analogy that he uses, by the way. said, it's like wake up in the morning, go to the bathroom, look in the mirror, and your hair is not combed, and, you need to shave, and, your teeth are really gross looking, and, you got like bags under your eyes, got some like dried spit from where you were drooling, and you just look at all of that, and then you just walk out the door and don't change anything about your appearance. And it's like, well, then why even bother looking? Why even bother looking in the mirror? What was the point of that if you're just going to go about your day? That's me. That's not James. But that's kind of what James is getting at here, I think, in a little goofy version of that. That's the big picture idea. So James ties this section back into the previous section with verse 25. Whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. So that last part, especially, they will be blessed in what they do, right? Perseverance in trials produces wisdom, which should be sought by believers, right? The blessings of God, right? Persevering and getting what you ask for. Well, what are you asking for? In James's context, you're asking for wisdom. So, right, perseverance, you're getting the blessings of God. Then James says, right, those who are doers of the word, they will be blessed in what they do. They will receive the blessings of God. This is your blank. My copy and your copy is so different. I have to switch back and forth. I'm trying to even find where we are. So, okay, single-minded perseverance. Okay, single-minded perseverance is an action. It is one who is a doer of the word. Now, this is a song that probably came out in the 80s, and so, y'all may or may not know this. I don't know. But there's a song. It's not, very theologically deep. It's not super interesting musically, but boy, does it get stuck in your head. And it's just, be a doer of the word. And it's basically just that for like 3 minutes. And it gets stuck in your head, man. I don't know. Have you all heard that?
No,
No?
never.
Did you
Man.
just make it up?
I'm not that creative. I'm not that creative. Anyway, that has nothing to do with James, but I mean it does. But that's not one of your blanks. You don't have to write down miscellaneous '80s Christian song. Anyway, okay. Right. So it's an action. It's one who's a doer of the word, and then this is your blank. The doing Christian is blessed because they receive the wisdom that they desire. Right? You're desiring wisdom. The wisdom is the blessing of God. Do not be a hearer, but be a doer. Then you will receive the blessings of God. Then you will receive wisdom. Right? So it's this strange, almost paradoxical relationship that these three concepts have. Perseverance through trials produces wisdom, but one needs wisdom in order to survive trials. So, let me see. Yes, this is also one of your blanks. Perhaps the wisdom the trials produce is produced in part during the trial itself. What am I learning in this? So this would be, let me get back to my version. This would be reading B. That would be reading B, right? God sends trials who then ask for wisdom in order to persevere into completion. Okay. So part of it is perhaps, part of the wisdom is produced during the trial itself. What am I learning in this? As well as part of it is probably produced after. What have I learned through this? All right, so that leaves us with the final two verses of chapter 1. And they kind of take the previous section's thoughts and just sort of like amplify them, you know. We talked about, you know, or I talked about biblical depression when we were in the Minor Prophets, war, famine, the pregnant women being like cut up and stuff, very morbid at times. Called that biblical depression, right? As I would say, we're no strangers to biblical depression. James presents a whole nother type of biblical depression where, you know, this is the book that like people read and they look at their own life and then they just like cry because they're not living up to James's standard. So it kind of takes the previous section's thoughts and amplifies them, right? Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless, is what James says. So, not only, this is your blank, not only does the double-minded or the inactive Christian not receive the blessings of God, that was what we just talked about. If you're a doer of the word, you're getting the blessings of God, which in James's context is wisdom. If you're inactive, if you're not a doer, you're not receiving the blessings of God. Your prayers are not being, you know, met, I guess. Not only is that the case, but these people who are inactive aren't even really a Christian, James says, right? You know, this inactive Christian isn't even really a Christian, right? All the moral do's and don'ts of this chapter, they all sort of revolve around speaking, right? Be quick to listen, slow to speak, right? You know, verse 26, basically, keep a tight rein on your tongue, right? You know, maybe James was dealing with some infighting, you know, I don't know. We've already done the background information, you know, we're not worried about that. That was last week. But, right, they all sort of revolve around speaking, right? Verse 27 is very reminiscent of one of the major themes that we trace throughout the Minor Prophets, which is the emphasis or the need for justice or mercy, right? Did anyone actually bring the big boy Minor Prophets thing that I printed out last week?
The review,
Yeah.
it's in the car.
I mean, don't go to your car to get it.
I didn't get in there with the knife and hammer.
Da-na-na-na-na-na-na.
Yeah, but I don't know if I'd recognize it if I saw it.
I mean, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. When I handed that out, one of the themes that we traced was the need for justice and the need for mercy. We saw this in Amos, right? God rejected Israel's offerings because there was no justice in the land, right? In Micah, you know, we have that, as I call it, the throw pillow verse, right? You know, like, I have no idea what the context of this is, but I like what it says. So I'm gonna put that on a t-shirt. I'm gonna put that on a throw pillow. You know, love justice, do mercy, walk humbly with your God, right? In Hosea, we read that Israel's root problem was their lack of knowledge about what God requires, which is mercy. And so in the Minor Prophets, right, it's all about, okay, it's not just these like external acts of worship or like these external covenantal actions. It's also the internal, right? And it's also specifically in their context, justice and mercy at a social, economic, political context. For James, however, there is justice, obviously, and mercy. I mean, he talks about the orphan and the widow and all of that. Right? But it's also, well, this is your blank. In addition to emphasizing justice or mercy, James in chapter 1 is emphasizing the tongue as the identifier of true worship. James calls a religion without a reined-in tongue
or in other words, a religion that, it isn't slow to speak, it isn't slow to anger, a religion that doesn't have a reined-in tone. He calls that worthless. This is another blank. In contrast, religion that is pure, or religion that leads to perfection, ultimately, has a reined-in tone and is active by loving orphans and widows. Okay, so I just gave you sort of 1, 2, 3. What we speak about and how we live, right? The reined-in tongue and then the loving the widows and orphans thing. These directly affect, one, our perseverance, which our perseverance we talked about also affects our blessing. The blessing is wisdom. You get wisdom through perseverance. If you're not perseverance, you're not going to get wisdom. You're not going to get the blessing. We talked about that. So our perseverance affects our blessing, which also affects our eternity, right? Because, a Christian that isn't doing, a Christian that isn't persevering, a Christian that isn't, speaking in love and loving widows and orphans and being concerned with justice and mercy is not a Christian at all, James says. So then, this is a blank. One who perseveres through trials and is a single-minded and active believer in Christ. I'll read that again. One who perseveres through trials and is a single-minded and active believer in Christ will be blessed by God. Not only with what they asked for, in James's case, wisdom, but also with a blank crown of life. So, you see this sort of 1, 2, 3. Once again, it can be positive or negative, okay? Right? If you are slow to speak, or what is it? Hold on. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. If you're all of those things, right, you're single-minded. You're persevering, right? Which affects your blessing. You're getting the wisdom thing, right? Which affects your eternity because you're single-minded on Christ. Which, as James says, you can't really, obviously we all at some points are double-minded, but long run, you can't be double-minded and then, expect at the end of times to just, rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub. It's been a good life. Let me in heaven. It doesn't work that way, James says. So it works positively. It also works negatively, right? If you, I hate all of the orphans in the world, right? All of the widow women need to die, right? If you hate widows and orphans, if you're, quick to speak and quick to anger and you just are a terrible person, right? You're not persevering. You're double-minded, right? You're serving God in something. You're serving God in yourself. You're serving God in money. You're serving God in Satan, I guess. You're serving whatever, which also affects your blessing. Obviously, you're not acting in wisdom. You're not going to get any more wisdom. As James says, this person, they should not expect to receive anything from the Lord, which also affects, as James says, our eternity. This is a worthless religion. This doesn't accomplish anything. So one who perseveres through trials and is a single-minded and active believer in Christ, they're going to be blessed. Not only, once again, when they ask for wisdom, but they're also going to be blessed with eternity, with that crown of life. Okay, and then this is the last blank. One who does not persevere through trials and is double-minded. One who does not persevere through trials and is double-minded and an inactive believer not only won't receive what they asked for, but they prove that they aren't a believer in Christ at all. So one who does not persevere through trials and is double-minded and an inactive believer in Christ not only won't receive what they asked for, but they prove that they aren't a believer in Christ at all. Again, biblical depression, but, instead of people starving to death and women being cut open, it's, oh boy, how do I possibly live up to this standard? But that's also the point, right? Because as James points out, right, God is the one who is single-minded. So anyway, but it's only week 1, so we don't have to figure out the whole puzzle yet. Anyway, did anyone miss any blanks? We're good?
I'm good.
All right.
Duty's on top of it.
Any questions or anything anyone wants to add?
So that phrase, for years, looking at years ago, that phrase double-minded, literally says two souls. A person who lives like they have two souls in them. And that reminds me of people of schizophrenic or whatever. So
Yeah, I mean,
that digs it kind of deep,
I don't know. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist.
Well, I'm not a psychiatrist either. As a granny clamp,
Don't be a spiritual schizophrenic. That's our lesson for today.
That's a good term. I may steal that one. Spiritual schizophrenic.
There you go.
There's a sermon in there. So
That'll preach. That's what they say. That'll preach.
Is that on for Sunday then?
maybe, I don't know.
Okay, I'll hand it over to Lester.
Well, this has been quite a night and several verses and all that. We want to share a prayer request and then close in prayer this evening. And if you have a prayer list, we're just not